Widow Nora Hale, 50 lashes! Mayor Alden Crane's voice ripped through Dusthaven Square like a gunshot, and before the echo had died, the whip cracked across her back. She jerked forward, the rope burning her wrists, her apron tearing where leather split flesh, but no scream passed her lips. A man's voice rang out over the crowd. 1! And laughter followed, cruel and sharp, as though the pain of a widow was sport enough to sweeten a hot afternoon. The second lash struck harder, and dust flew from the post when she slammed against it, but her teeth clamped down, blood filling her mouth before any cry could escape. 2! Another voice shouted, eager to keep the count. By the 5th, children in the crowd were whispering, unsure whether to laugh or turn away, while their mothers dragged them closer, whispering that law must be seen. 10! The crowd cheered as if it were some festival, the mayor's smirk broadening with every cry. Nora's knees trembled, her vision swimming, but she lifted her head, staring past them all toward the horizon, as though if she could see something farther, something freer, the fire on her back would not break her. Clara Jenkins stood at the front, her apron smeared with flour from the bakery, both hands pressed to her mouth, whispering desperate prayers into her palms. But the mayor snapped at her. "Eyes open, woman! Let the law be your teacher!" Nora took the 11th lash then, gasping through her teeth, her breath rattling like a bellows with holes. At 20, the sound of jeering faltered, replaced by murmurs, because her back was more blood than cloth now, and still she would not beg. The sheriff hesitated at 25, the leather slick in his hands, but Crane snarled, "Do your duty!" and the whip cracked again. 30! A man shouted, but the sound broke off, ashamed of his own voice. Nora swayed against the post, her cheek striking wood, her breath a broken rasp. 35! Another hissed, though softer, because silence was spreading like an infection, muting laughter, swallowing cruelty. Each stroke after that landed in near hush, the only sound the whistle of leather and the dull slap of flesh. At 40 she sagged, her knees buckling and her head dropped, strands of hair hiding her face. At 45 she groaned low, the first sound of pain, and Clara sobbed openly, the sound piercing the heavy air. 49! Someone counted, but it was not shouted this time. It was whispered, guilty, trembling. Then the 50th cut across her shoulders, deep and final, and she collapsed, her cheek sinking into the dust, the rope going slack as her body gave way. The square went silent. Not even the flies buzzed near. Nora lay motionless, blood pooling through her apron, dust sticking to her skin where it was torn. Her breath was shallow, a thin rasp rising and falling in the hush. The sheriff lowered the whip, his hand shaking. For the first time in years, Mayor Crane found no one to cheer for him, no voice to echo his sentence. In that terrible stillness, boots scraped against the boardwalk. A man stepped forward. Jonas Creed, the silent rancher, tall and broad, known across Dusthaven for never wasting words, moved with slow, deliberate strides. The crowd parted before him without command. He shrugged the heavy wool coat from his shoulders and crossed the square. Without a word, he laid it gently over Nora's broken body, kneeling as he did. The coat covered more than her wounds. It covered the shame of every man and woman who had stood and watched. The silence that followed was heavier than any law. The square did not breathe when Jonas Creed laid his coat across Nora Hale's torn back. Dust clung to the heavy wool, already dark with her blood, and his shadow stretched long over her body where she lay collapsed. For years, Dusthaven had known him as the man who said nothing, who kept to his ranch and nodded when spoken to, his silence often mocked as simple-mindedness. Yet now, in the raw noon heat, his silence carried more weight than every jeer that had filled the square. Clara Jenkins fell to her knees at the sight, her tears spilling freely, and whispered, "God help her," though her voice trembled as much with awe as grief. The sheriff shifted uneasily, the whip still dangling from his hand, his eyes flicking to Mayor Crane as though begging for direction. Crane's jaw clenched, fury twisting his face at the sight of his punishment unraveling into shame. "Remove him," he barked, but his words fell flat in the heavy quiet. No man stepped forward. Jonas remained kneeling, his hand pressing the coat firm against Nora's shoulders, his head bowed as if she were kin, as if the act alone could shield her from 50 lashes the crowd had counted and cheered. Somewhere a child whimpered. A rancher cleared his throat and dropped his gaze to his boots, unwilling to meet anyone's eyes. The spell of cruelty that had bound Dusthaven's people began to unravel thread by thread, replaced by a silence that stung more sharply than the whip itself. "Do you all forget who rules here?" Crane shouted, his voice high with desperation. "This is law. This is Dusthaven." He turned in circles, searching for one man to echo him. But faces avoided his glare, eyes fixed on the coat in the dust. Jonas said nothing. He did not rise. He only kept his hand steady, as though declaring without words that no one would strip her dignity again. Clara rose shakily to her feet, wiping her face, and stepped toward the post. "She's had enough," she said, her voice breaking but loud enough to be heard. "Enough." A murmur followed, faint but present, like the first drops of rain before a storm. The mayor's eyes burned with hatred. "You dare defy me for a widow who couldn't pay her own keep! She is nothing, less than nothing!" He pointed a finger toward Nora, crumpled and bleeding beneath the coat. "And he," his finger swung to Jonas, "is a fool who hides behind silence." Still Jonas gave him no words. He rose slowly to his feet, lifting Nora into his arms as gently as if she weighed no more than a child. Her head lolled against his chest, her eyes fluttering open for a heartbeat before closing again. The sight of her wrapped in his coat, carried against him like something sacred, burned into the eyes of everyone gathered. A groan of shame rippled through the crowd, unspoken, but felt. The baker's apprentice dropped his cap. A farmer gripped his son's shoulder as if to steady him. The sheriff lowered the whip, shame written in the slump of his shoulders. Jonas turned toward the livery, each step slow but unchallenged, and the crowd parted as though a road had been cut through them. No one dared touch him. No one dared look too long at the man who had broken their silence with silence. For the first time in years, Dusthaven felt smaller than the truth carried in one man's arms. Jonas Creed carried Nora Hale through the parted crowd as if he were walking through smoke. The silence so dense it clung to every man and woman who had moments before cheered the count. His boots struck steady against the boards, the weight in his arms heavy but cradled with the care of something irreplaceable. Her blood seeped through his coat, staining the wool dark, and every drop was a reminder to the people of Dusthaven of what they had allowed. Mayor Alden Crane's face twisted with disbelief. His authority had always been unquestioned. His decrees rang louder than sermons, his punishments carried out without protest. Yet here, before his eyes, his spectacle had been stolen. He stepped onto the platform, his finger stabbing the air. "You will stop!" he roared, spittle flying. "Sheriff, arrest him! Arrest them both!" The sheriff's hand twitched toward his holster, but his feet remained planted. The whip hung limp at his side, the weight of shame bending his shoulders. The crowd muttered, restless, uncertain, caught between fear of Crane and the quiet defiance Jonas had laid before them. "You're all cowards!" Crane thundered, his face red, his voice cracking. She owes. She mocked the law, and he's nothing but a savage hiding in plain sight, too simple to speak, too dumb to know his place. The insults cracked, but they struck no fire. For the first time, his words sounded smaller than the scene unfolding. A widow limp in a rancher's arms, covered not by shame, but by a coat laid in honor. Clara Jenkins stepped forward, flour still clinging to her sleeves. Her voice trembled, but carried across the square. "She owed nothing," she said, her words sharp as knives. "You took from her because you could, and we watched." Gasps rippled through the crowd. No one had spoken against the mayor in years. Crane rounded on her, fury flashing. "You'll regret that," he hissed. "You'll regret this day, every one of you. Debt will be collected. Hunger will teach you what silence could not." He turned back toward Jonas, who had stopped at the edge of the square, his tall frame casting a long shadow. Jonas looked over the heads of the people, his face unreadable, his eyes steady. He did not answer, not a word. Yet his stillness, his refusal to bow or retreat, carried more than a speech. It said plainly, "You cannot whip silence into obedience when silence itself chooses to resist." A murmur spread in the crowd, low at first, then growing. Men shifted their weight, uneasy with their own complicity. Women clutched children tighter, some weeping silently. The mayor shouted again, demanding obedience, but his voice now cracked with desperation. Jonas turned his back on him and carried Nora into the livery. The crowd, without speaking, followed his lead. Not in words, but in a silence that suddenly belonged to them. And for the first time, Crane's fury echoed without answer. By evening, Dusthaven was no longer one town, but two. On one side were those who had cheered as the lashes fell, now whispering excuses in the saloon. "Law's law," they muttered. The mayor had no choice. On the other side were those who had fallen silent at the 50th lash, haunted by the sight of Jonas Creed's coat draped over a broken widow, by the memory of Clara Jenkins daring to speak aloud what they had all buried. The streets hummed with division, voices lowered but sharp, neighbors passing each other with narrowed eyes. At the livery, lanterns flickered against the walls. Inside, Jonas laid Nora gently on a bed of hay softened with torn blankets Clara had brought from her bakery. Her breath was shallow, her skin fever-hot, but her eyes opened for moments at a time, finding his face. She whispered once, so faint it was almost nothing. "Why?" Jonas said nothing, but he pressed the coat tighter around her shoulders, his silence an answer stronger than words. Clara bustled beside him, laying out bread and a jug of water, her hands trembling. "She won't last if the fever holds," she whispered, glancing at Jonas. "But I'll not leave her. Not after what you did." Outside, a small cluster of townsfolk lingered, shame tugging them toward the livery, though fear held them back. A farmer's wife slipped in quietly, leaving a jar of milk near the door. A blacksmith's boy set down a folded quilt, then vanished before anyone could notice. Small acts, timid and half-hidden, but they carried the weight of conscience. Across town, Mayor Crane stewed in his office, pacing before his desk, his face dark with rage. "Ungrateful worms," he snarled, pouring whiskey into a glass with shaking hands. "All it took was one man with no tongue to ruin years of order." He drafted a list of debts in his ledger, vowing to collect them before the week ended, to crush defiance with hunger, if not the whip. By the time dusk thickened into night, the square lay quiet, but every house hummed with whispered arguments. Some cursed Nora for dragging Dusthaven into shame. Others prayed for her recovery. The sheriff sat alone, staring at the whip on his desk, his fingers twitching but never reaching for it. At the livery, Jonas sat watch through the night, silent as always, his shadow steady against the lantern flame. Nora stirred in her fever dreams, whispering words she no longer knew were heard. "Don't let them take me back." Jonas did not move, but the coat remained firm around her, his silence holding the promise she begged for. Outside, Dusthaven shifted uneasily, a town caught between two truths: the mayor's law written in ink and fear, and the unspoken vow carried by a rancher who needed no words to make it known. By noon the next day, Mayor Alden Crane strode into the square with his ledger tucked beneath one arm, the great book of debts that had bound Dusthaven tighter than any rope. His face was red with fury and sweat, his eyes blazing as he climbed the wooden platform. "You think a coat changes law?" he shouted, holding the ledger high for all to see. "This book is law. Every name inside owes me, every acre, every barn, every loaf of bread. If you dare defy me, you'll lose everything." He slammed it down on the platform with a crack, the sound splitting the air like a pistol shot. Murmurs rippled through the gathered crowd. Farmers shifted uneasily. Women pulled their children closer. Fear had long lived in those pages. Hunger, foreclosure, shame. Even Clara felt her knees weaken, knowing her name lay scrawled in that ink. Crane grinned at their unease, pounding the ledger with his fist. "One widow and one mute rancher will not undo me. Tonight I call every debt, and by dawn I'll own Dusthaven entire." His words might have crushed them, but then a small voice broke through the square. The Comanche girl, the very child Nora had bled for, stepped forward from the crowd. Clara gasped, trying to reach for her, but the child walked with bare feet across the dust, clutching Nora's torn apron in her tiny hands. She held it aloft, stiff with blood, and her voice rang clear as a bell. "She hurt for me. She hurt for no reason. And you laughed." The square went still. Men dropped their gazes, shame crawling across their faces. Women wept softly. The girl's dark eyes swept the crowd, her voice trembling but strong. She gave what no one else would. "You cannot call that debt. You cannot call that shame." Gasps followed, and all at once Clara's voice cut through, fierce as fire. "She's right. That book didn't build Dusthaven. We did. And it bled us dry while we watched a widow whipped for nothing." The crowd stirred, murmurs rising into angry voices. The sheriff stepped forward, glancing at the mayor, then at the blood-soaked apron in the girl's hands. For the first time, his grip loosened on his badge. Crane's face contorted, shouting over the roar, "You'll regret this rebellion. You'll starve without me." But his words were drowned out by a chant swelling from the people, low at first, then rolling like thunder. "No child alone! No child alone!" The same vow the brothers had spoken now spread through the crowd, echoing across Dusthaven, rattling the windows. Crane's knuckles whitened on the ledger. Jonas Creed stood near the livery door, his hat brim shadowing his eyes, and for a moment his silence seemed louder than the chant. Then, without a word, he stepped forward, pulled a torch from a wagon rail, and set the corner of the ledger aflame. Flames leapt, devouring ink and paper, and the crowd gasped as years of fear curled into ash. Crane screamed, reaching for the burning book, but Elias, the blacksmith's son, kicked it deeper into the fire. The chant thundered louder, and Dusthaven trembled on the edge of something it had never known before. Freedom, born from defiance. Mayor Alden Crane's scream cut through the square as the ledger turned to ash, his face blotched crimson, his voice cracking with rage. "You think fire frees you?" he howled, spit flying as he stumbled from the platform. "You've killed yourselves. By sundown you'll beg me for scraps." He jabbed a finger towards the crowd, but his words fell flat against the chant still rolling like thunder. Dusthaven had tasted its first breath of defiance, and no ledger could chain it back. Yet Crane had ruled too long to yield so easily. With a violent snap of his hand, he signaled to two mounted men who had been waiting at the edge of town. Riders dressed in dust-worn coats, rifles slung low. They spurred their horses forward, circling the square in a storm of hooves and grit, the animals' eyes rolling white, the ground trembling beneath the iron strike of hooves. Women pulled children close, men grabbed fence rails, fear rushing back into them like floodwater through a cracked dam. The chant faltered, voices breaking into panicked cries. Crane sneered, his chest swelling as he saw heads bow once more. "This is my law," he shouted above the thunder of hooves. "One man's silence won't save you. One widow's coat won't feed you. You belong to me." A rider jerked his reins, horse rearing, the barrel of his rifle gleaming as it swung across the crowd. Mothers screamed, dragging their children into doorways. The sheriff reached for his pistol, then froze, torn between orders and conscience. Amid the chaos, the child Nora had saved clung still to her bloodied apron, her tiny voice drowned out by the stampede. But Jonas Creed moved. He stepped into the square, his frame a dark figure against the circling dust, the brim of his hat shadowing eyes that never left the riders. He did not draw a weapon. He never did. He simply stood. A whip crack of hooves bore down on him, one rider shouting for him to move, threatening to trample him flat. Jonas didn't flinch. And then, in the quiet between hoofbeats, a smaller voice rang out, high and clear, the Comanche girl darting from the crowd to stand before Jonas, holding up the blood-soaked apron like a flag. "No child alone," she cried. The square froze, hooves pounded to a halt inches from her. Silence dropped heavier than any whip. The riders looked to Crane, but his command faltered, his mouth open and empty of power. The chant began again, not whispered this time, but shouted with every voice that could rise. "No child alone! No child alone!" The words filled the dust-choked air, rattling windows, shaking boards. Jonas bent just enough to lift the girl behind him, shielding her with the weight of his silence, his coat still over Nora's broken shoulders. Crane's fury curdled into desperation, his eyes darting as control slipped from his grasp. He had lost the ledger, lost the square, and now even fear itself was slipping through his hands. The riders circled no more. Their mounts stamped nervously in the dust, ears flicking at the chant rolling through the square like a storm wind. "No child alone! No child alone!" Men and women who only an hour ago had swallowed their shame now shouted until their throats burned, their fear beaten back by the sight of a widow's blood and a silent rancher's coat. Mayor Alden Crane stood on the platform, his hands trembling at his sides, his power bleeding out with every cry. He bellowed over the voices, his words ragged. "Enough! You think chants and silence will keep you alive? You think fire makes you free?" His eyes darted, wild. Then he snarled, "If law will not hold you, fire will. By sundown your barns will burn. Your cattle will choke in smoke. I'll turn Dusthaven into ash, and I'll see you crawling to me for mercy." The threat hung in the hot air, heavier than the whip had ever been. Murmurs wavered. The chant faltered. Men remembered haylofts packed with dry straw. Women thought of cribs beside oil lamps. Children clutched mothers' skirts. Fear seeped back, and Crane saw it. He spread his arms wide, laughing hoarsely. "Yes, that's right. I fed you once. I can starve you now. I built this town. I can bury it with flame. Without me, you are nothing." His words cracked like kindling. The riders raised their rifles, ready to prove his threats were not empty. Panic rippled through the crowd, some stumbling back, others shouting for children to run. Clara Jenkins gripped the rail beside her, her knuckles white, then shouted with a voice raw from weeping, "And what will you be, Alden Crane? When there's nothing left but ashes, you'll own a graveyard and call it a kingdom." Gasps followed her defiance, but Crane's laugh only deepened, a sound sharp as broken glass. "Better a kingdom of bones than a town of traitors," he roared. The square swayed between terror and resolve, the chant sputtering, the people teetering. Then Jonas Creed stepped forward again, still silent, but with a weight that pulled every eye. He lifted his hand, palm steady, pointing not to the mare but to the riders' torches tucked in their saddles. With calm precision, he drew his coat from Nora's shoulders, still heavy with blood, and held it high before the crowd. Then he dropped it in the dust and ground his boot into it, smothering the spark before it could begin. The message was clear. Fire could be threatened, but it could also be stamped out. A murmur surged through the people, steadier now, the chant rekindling louder, fiercer. "No child alone, no fire here." The riders hesitated, rifles trembling, their eyes flicking between Crane's rage and the tide of townsfolk rising against him. The mayor's threats cracked hollow in the roar, his power crumbling faster than flame eats dry wood. Dusthaven was shifting, and the ground beneath his boots no longer belonged to him. Mayor Alden Crane's face was a storm of sweat and fury, his threats of fire swallowed by the chant that rolled like thunder through the square. "No child alone, no fire here." The words rose from every mouth, louder than the hooves of the restless horses, louder than the fury dripping from his lips. His grip slipped on the edges of power, but a man like Crane never released it willingly. He reached into his coat, yanking free a pistol, its steel glinting in the unforgiving light. The crowd gasped as one. Mothers screamed, pulling children close. Men froze in half steps, torn between fear and fury. Clara Jenkins clutched the rail beside her, her cry sharp as glass. "Stop him!" Crane leveled the pistol toward the livery door, where Jonas Creed stood silent, the Comanche girl clutching Nora's bloodied apron at his side. "You think silence makes you strong?" Crane spat, his hand steady despite his shaking rage. "Then watch silence die, watch your hero bleed." His finger tightened on the trigger. The crowd drew in breath like a single body. For one heartbeat, Dusthaven hung between past and future, between obedience born of fear and rebellion lit by courage. Then Jonas moved. Not fast, not wild, but with the calm precision of a man who had lived in silence so long he could hear a world others missed. He shifted, stepping in front of the girl, his broad frame a shield, his eyes steady on Crane's. No words, no plea, just the unshakable truth of a man who would not yield. The mayor hesitated, rage colliding with the weight of that gaze. But desperation is a cornered beast. He cocked the hammer. Before the shot could break, a hand lunged from the crowd. The blacksmith's widow, frail and limping, yet fierce with a courage she had buried too long. She struck his wrist with a heavy ladle she had carried from her home, the pistol firing into the air. The crack split the sky, birds scattering from rooftops, but no blood spilled. Crane staggered, the pistol torn from his grip, clattering into the dust. Gasps erupted, then shouts, then cheers rising raw and unrestrained. The widow's voice, hoarse but ringing, cut through. "No more! Not for her! Not for us!" The chant swelled again, fiercer, the people pressing closer. Riders hesitated, rifles trembling, but their faces faltered at the sight of women, men, even children advancing with shovels, boards, stones, anything they could wield not for violence, but for defiance. Crane scrambled in the dust, clawing for the pistol, but a boot slammed down. Jonas Creed's. The silent rancher pressed it into the dirt, his eyes never leaving Crane's. Still he said nothing, but his silence roared louder than gunfire. The mayor's last card had been played and broken in front of the very people he sought to own. Dusthaven had seen him bare, and found nothing worth fearing. The pistol lay crushed into the dust beneath Jonas Creed's boot, its metal gleaming useless in the sunlight. Mayor Alden Crane clawed at it with filthy hands, his face red, spittle on his lips. But Jonas did not move, his silence a wall stronger than any iron. Around them, the crowd pressed closer, the air alive with breath and fury. The blacksmith's widow still clutched her bent ladle, her chest heaving, her eyes blazing brighter than forge fire. "No more," she rasped again, and her voice carried, steadying the town like a hand upon a trembling colt. The chant began softly, hesitant at first. "No child alone," then louder as voices caught and carried it, swelling until even the riders' horses snorted and stamped beneath the sound. "No child alone! No child alone!" Dusthaven trembled with the vow, its rhythm shaking windows, rattling the mayor's very bones. Crane staggered to his feet, spinning to face them, his eyes wide, his voice breaking into shrill protest. "You fools! Without me you are nothing. Without my law this town starves." He reached for the crowd, as though he might still seize them with bare hands, but they stepped back, not from fear, but from disgust. Clara Jenkins moved forward, her flower-streaked apron trembling at her knees. She lifted her voice, louder than she had ever spoken in her life. "We've starved with you. We've bled with you. All you gave us was debt and lash. We are done." The crowd roared agreement, fists raising, mothers clutching children high as if to show they would never kneel again. The sheriff pushed through the mass, his badge glinting in the sun, his face pale but resolved. For years he had obeyed Crane's commands, but now he tore the whip from his own belt and threw it at the mayor's feet. "I serve Dusthaven," he said simply, his voice firm. "Not you." Gasps broke into cheers. Men stepped forward with tools in their hands, women with baskets and sticks, not to kill, but to stand. Even children joined, their small fists pumping with the chant. Crane's voice cracked as he screamed, "I built you! I fed you! You cannot—" But his words were drowned. He stumbled back onto the platform, cornered by the very people he had ruled. Jonas stepped forward, each stride heavy, inevitable. His coat still bore Nora Hale's blood, dark against the wool, but he wore it across his shoulders once more, a banner of defiance. He mounted the steps without a word, his shadow stretching over Crane. The mayor shrank beneath it, his knees buckling. For the first time in his life, Alden Crane was silent. Jonas did not strike him. He only stood there, eyes hard, silence deeper than judgment, and the crowd knew the verdict had already been passed. Dusthaven no longer feared him. Fear itself had fallen. The square no longer belonged to Alden Crane. His whip lay abandoned, his ledger burned, his pistol crushed into dust. He stood trembling on the platform, eyes darting like a trapped animal's, sweat soaking through his fine coat. Once, the crowd would have bowed their heads at his glare. Now, not a soul looked away. They pressed closer, their chant rolling like thunder between the buildings. "No child alone! No child alone!" Each voice struck him harder than the lash he had ordered for Nora Hale. He raised his hands, shaking. "Please, listen," he stammered, his tone cracked and pitiful. I gave you bread in the famine. I lent you seed. I kept you alive when the mines failed." His words fell like stones into a river, drowned beneath the current of defiance. Clara Jenkins stepped forward, her chin lifted. "You didn't feed us. You bought us. You turned hunger into a chain, and you pulled it tight." She turned to the crowd, voice carrying like never before. This man fed on our shame. He whipped a widow for our silence, but today, we end it. A roar answered her, the chant cresting until it shook the boards beneath Crane's feet. The sheriff climbed onto the platform, his badge glinting, his face pale but resolute. For years he had been Crane's arm of punishment. Now, in a single motion, he snapped his badge free and threw it at Crane's chest. "The law is not you," he said. "Not anymore." The mayor sagged, his legs folding beneath him. He fell to his knees, grasping at the boards, sputtering excuses no one heard. Dusthaven was already turning away from him. Jonas Creed stepped onto the platform, his tall frame casting Crane into shadow. He did not speak, but the silence around him was absolute. In his arms, wrapped still in his coat, Nora stirred faintly, her lips parting in a whisper no one but Jonas could hear. "Is it over?" His eyes softened, though his face remained carved from stone. He lowered his head in a single nod, a vow without words. Clara and two women rushed forward, helping Nora down from Jonas's arms, laying her gently onto a quilt in the shade. The crowd turned to her, their gazes full not of pity but of reverence. Mothers hushed their children, men removed their hats, and even the sheriff bowed his head. Crane, forgotten at their feet, reached out with trembling hands. "I am your mayor, your protector." But his voice was drowned as the chant began again, stronger, fiercer. No longer just words, but a promise forged in blood and silence. No child alone. Dusthaven had chosen, and in that choice, Crane was nothing. By dusk, the air over Dusthaven hung thick with the smell of smoke from the burned ledger and the iron tang of blood. The townsfolk lingered in the square, as if afraid to leave lest the spell of courage break. Nora lay propped against quilts the women had gathered, her breath shallow but steadier, her eyes fluttering open now and then. Every time she stirred, heads turned, as though they needed to see her alive to believe their own defiance was real. Alden Crane remained on his knees at the edge of the platform, his fine coat caked in dust, his face streaked with sweat and humiliation. Now and again he muttered promises or threats, but no one listened. For the first time in his reign, Dusthaven had turned its back on him. The sheriff stepped forward, standing tall beside Clara Jenkins. His voice was rough but firm, carrying across the hush. "You've all seen what law under one man's thumb brings: fear, debt, lash." He looked to Nora, wrapped still in Jonas Creed's blood-stained coat. "But you've also seen what silence and courage can do. She took lashes meant for another child. He gave her his coat when the rest of us looked away. That is law worth following." Clara's voice trembled but rose. "Nora Hale is no longer just a widow. She is proof that Dusthaven's soul is not gone. She bled for a child who wasn't hers, and in doing so, she showed us what family truly means. Today we crown her with honor." A murmur swelled, agreement rippling like wind through wheat. Jonas Creed stepped forward, carrying the coat once more. He did not raise his voice. He simply placed the heavy wool back across Nora's shoulders. She flinched at its weight, then held it close, eyes brimming with tears. Clara tied the apron, the same one torn in the whipping, over the coat like a sash. The blacksmith's widow pressed a sprig of sage into Nora's hand. A ranch boy knelt, laying down a stone from his field as if it were treasure. One by one they came forward, farmers with seed pouches, wives with scraps of bread, children with trinkets from their pockets. A crown not of gold, but of gifts offered freely. Crane croaked from his knees, "This is madness. You make her a queen of beggars." But his words died beneath the roar of voices rising. "No child alone! No child alone!" The chant shook the square, louder than whips, stronger than debt, each shout another nail in the coffin of his power. Jonas remained at Nora's side, silent as always. But when her hand trembled toward his, he clasped it in both of his own. And for the first time since the lashes fell, she smiled. Dusthaven had passed its verdict, and it was written not in ink or pain, but in the blood of a widow and the silence of a rancher who had never needed words to speak truth. Morning broke over Dusthaven with a hush unlike any before. The square, once a stage for lash and fear, now smelled of bread baking in Clara Jenkins's ovens and hay laid fresh in the livery where Nora Hale rested. The people came not with jeers but with offerings: milk jars, loaves, bolts of cloth, seed pouches, each placed quietly at her side as if payment for the debt they all owed her, but could never truly repay. Nora stirred beneath Jonas Creed's coat, her back bandaged, her breaths shallow but stronger. When her eyes opened, they met Clara's tearful smile, and the little Comanche girl curled at her side, refusing to leave. "It wasn't for glory," Nora whispered, her voice raw. "I just couldn't let her suffer." Clara pressed her hand. "That's why we will not forget." Outside, Alden Crane sat bound in the jailhouse, his voice hoarse from shouting, but no one came to hear. His rule had ended not with blood, but with the silence of a town that no longer feared him. In the square, men repaired the whipping post, not to use but to tear down plank by plank, their hammers striking like a rhythm of rebirth. Women painted words across the wall of the old store: "No child alone." Children ran barefoot through the dust, shouting the vow as if it were a game, their laughter washing away years of dread. At sunset, the townsfolk gathered once more, not to witness punishment, but to share a meal laid on long boards across the square. Bread and milk and stew filled bowls, and every mouth was fed. Nora sat among them, pale but upright, her shoulders wrapped in the coat that had become more than cloth. It was symbol, shield, and crown. Jonas stood behind her, silent as ever, his presence enough. A ranch boy asked him softly, "Will you speak, mister?" Jonas rested a hand on the boy's shoulder, shook his head gently, and looked instead to Nora. The message was clear. Her voice was the one that mattered now. As the sun dipped low, painting the horizon in fire and gold, Nora lifted her gaze over Dusthaven, her voice steady despite the rasp. "We will not go back," she said. "No debt, no lash, no fear will bind us again. We belong to each other now." Hats were removed, heads bowed, tears wiped unashamed. Clara's voice rose, firm and bright. "No child alone." And once more the vow spread until it thundered through the town, shaking windows and hearts alike. Nora closed her eyes, feeling its weight and its promise. For the first time since her husband's death, she did not feel alone. Jonas laid his hand gently on her shoulder, silent, but his silence said what words could not, that Dusthaven had been reborn, and she had been crowned not with gold, but with honor carved into the marrow of every soul who had stood and watched her bleed. And as the stars rose above the quiet town, the vow held fast, echoing into the night like a hymn. No child alone, no child forgotten, no child left behind. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted stories on Stories Left Behind. If you had been in Dusthaven that day, would you have stood in silence with Jonas or lifted your voice with the crowd? Tell us in the comments.